Keanu Reeves, the legend of legends, the priceless treasure of Hollywood, a rare gift the world may never see again. He is not only Neo, the one who bent reality in the Matrix, but also John Wick, the Avenger who carved vengeance into legend. He is the living heartbeat of cinema, the silent storm that has given his body, soul, and kindness to generations of audiences. In a world of entertainment overflowing with illusions and ego, Keanu shines differently. He is the kindest, most genuine man in Hollywood, the most humble soul among the stars. A human treasure whose generosity has touched strangers and whose dignity has silenced critics, an angel walking among us. Kind, compassionate, humble, strikingly handsome, and so much more, he is living proof that perhaps there truly is one man loved by the entire world. He is the reason we believe goodness still exists and why we wish everyone could be like him. Yet, behind that undying glory, behind the smile that has soothed millions of hearts, lie wounds that will never fully heal. Cold, suffocating nights and shadows cling to his soul as if to tear it apart piece by piece. Now at 61, the man who once seemed unbreakable is still battling through the darkest chapters of life, where pain refuses to let go and haunting memories surround him, while cruel challenges to his health grow heavier. Do not look away, for what he endures now may be the deepest chapter of his life. If you believe Keanu Reeves is not only an actor, but a legend of compassion, let your like shine and drop a hearted in the comments as an eternal tribute to Hollywood's rarest treasure. The first wounds of Keanu Reeves were not written by fame, but by childhood itself. A father who disappeared, a mother chasing stability through broken marriages, siblings scattered across different branches of a fractured family tree, and a boy learning far too soon that love could dissolve in a single breath. And Keanu Charles Reeves entered the world on September 2, 1964, in Beirut, Lebanon. Even his name carried poetry. Keanu in Hawaiian means cool breeze over the mountains. Yet the poetry of his early life was smothered almost immediately by turbulence. His father, Samuel Nolan Reeves Jr., a Hawaiian geologist of Chinese, Portuguese, and English ancestry, and his mother, Patricia Taylor, an English costume designer, were already drifting apart when he was born. Within 2 years, their marriage collapsed, and his earliest memories were etched not in comfort, but in absence. His father's shadow loomed larger by its very disappearance. At 2, he was gone. At 13, Keanu saw him for the last time on Hawaiian soil, a farewell without words, a silence that would never be broken. It was as if he vanished into silence, Reeves later recalled. Decades later, he would admit to Penthouse, "We believed our lives would be better if we had our father with us, but no return ever came." Patricia carried the crushing weight of survival, her career pulling the family from Beirut to Sydney, then to New York, and finally to Toronto. At each stop, she sought security in new marriages, yet each fractured in turn, leaving behind a carousel of stepfathers who never stayed long enough to be remembered as family. Out of this instability came half-sisters and step-siblings. Karina Miller, born from one marriage, and Emma Reeves from his father's later life. But only Kim, his younger sister, shared both parents and the storms of their childhood. To Keanu, Kim was not just a sibling, but the only proof that family could be something more than a word in transit. For the Reeves children, childhood meant suitcases half-packed, walls that never stayed familiar, and birthdays celebrated in cities that blurred together. Home was never a sanctuary, only a pause before the next upheaval. School, offered no shelter. Over 5 years, Keanu cycled through 4 high schools, struggling to adapt. Dyslexia slowed his reading, making every classroom a battlefield. Letters refused to stay still on the page while classmates surged ahead. Teachers mistook his restless energy for defiance. One principal expelled him outright for asking too many questions. "I questioned everything too much," Reeves later admitted. "I couldn't help it, even if it got me into trouble." Labeled a difficult student, he was in truth only a boy desperate to understand a world that never stopped shifting beneath his feet. Amid the chaos, one sanctuary emerged: the ice rink. As a goalkeeper, Keanu was called the Wall, his reflexes and resilience earning him respect. Behind the mask, he found belonging, a rare identity he could claim. He dreamed of the Ontario Hockey League, even of skating under Canada's flag at the Olympics. For a boy with no lasting home, hockey was more than sport. It was purpose, joy, and proof that he could be unbreakable. Then came the cruel twist. At just 15 years old, when most teenagers still dream freely of the future, a devastating injury tore his hockey dream away in an instant, leaving him sidelined while others chased the future he had imagined. What had once been the only stable anchor in his life was ripped away, teaching him once again how mercilessly fragile security could be. By the end of his teens, Keanu had endured what would shatter many adults: the silence of an absent father, the instability of a mother's broken marriages, the sting of being left behind in classrooms, the ache of fractured sibling bonds, and the heartbreak of watching his greatest dream vanish on the ice. It was a cruel apprenticeship in grief, teaching him that joy could be temporary and belonging always uncertain. And yet, these wounds did not harden him into bitterness. They forged him. An absent father gave him empathy for the abandoned. A carousel of stepfathers taught him that trust must be earned. Dyslexia gave him patience with imperfection. And the injury that ended hockey nudged him towards the stage and screen, opening the door to the destiny that would one day make him a legend. Looking back decades later, Reeves reflected, "Grief changes shape, but it never ends." In that truth lies the echo of a boy who first tasted loss long before Hollywood's spotlight found him. His childhood was not simply a preface to greatness. It was the furnace where pain and perseverance collided, melting into the quiet strength, humility, and resilience that would one day make the world fall in love with Keanu Reeves. When the roar of the hockey rink was stolen from him at 15, Keanu did not surrender to silence. Instead, the stage began to whisper, and a boy who had lost so much discovered that stories could become his new refuge. What he did not yet know was that this new dream would demand not only talent, but the same hunger and endurance that had already defined his young life. By the time he walked away from school, branded a misfit, he had already decided that performance would be his salvation. Dyslexia turned every script into a battlefield, but the camera never demanded speed, it demanded honesty. He scraped together odd jobs in small Canadian TV shows, downed soda in a Coca-Cola commercial with the desperation of an underdog proving he belonged, and even hosted a children's program where his awkward charm somehow won over young viewers. These were not glamorous beginnings. They were survival wages for a boy who had already made survival his second skin. Armed with little more than a battered Volvo, a suitcase, and a name most couldn't pronounce, Keanu drove into Los Angeles, chasing a fragile hope. He rented bare apartments, stretched every dollar until cupboards went empty, and knocked on doors that rarely opened. Casting agents studied him with puzzled eyes. Was he a leading man, or just another drifter? In a city that chewed up dreamers by the thousands, Hollywood's gates were heavy, and Keanu had only his bare hands. Then a flicker of recognition. A bleak indie film, River's Edge, revealed a soul wrestling with shadows far deeper than the industry had expected. Soon after, Permanent Record cast him as a young man mourning a friend's death, and critics began to murmur that his performances carried a weight too raw to be manufactured. They were right. The grief on screen was a mirror of the losses he had carried all along. In this fragile window, he also crossed paths with River Phoenix, a kindred spirit who shared his hunger for truth in art. Their bond gave Keanu for the first time a sense of belonging in an industry that had mostly greeted him with doubt. But fate, merciless as ever, was already waiting for them both. Just as he reached for roles of depth, destiny played another cruel trick. Bill and Ted's excellent adventure turned him into a cultural phenomenon beloved by millions as the goofy, time-traveling Ted. But what felt like a joyful reprieve quickly became a cage. The Airhead label clung to him, as if Hollywood had decided he was too light for darkness, too simple for tragedy. Years later, he admitted, "I craved something light-hearted, but that label stayed with me for years." Even triumph had teeth, and every cheer carried its shadow. These beginnings were never triumph without cost. Each success echoed with the ghosts of his past. The boy expelled for asking too many questions, now dismissed for wanting too much depth. The teenager whose dream on the ice was stolen, now chasing another dream under unforgiving lights. Fame was on the horizon, but it came not as a gift, it came as another uphill climb. And yet, in those lean years, in the rejections, the cheap apartments, the endless auditions, Keanu was quietly proving something greater than stardom. He was building endurance, the same resilience that had carried him through absent fathers, fractured homes, and empty cupboards was now carrying him through Hollywood's fickle gates. The boy who once packed and unpacked suitcases for every new city had learned to carry his true home inside himself. Persistence, humility, and a refusal to quit. The world had not yet crowned him a legend, but he had already revealed the truth that mattered most. He would not break. Keanu Reeves entered the 1990s not as Hollywood's golden child, but as its quiet outsider. Tall, restless, carrying more scars than connections. Yet, the screen quickly revealed what others had overlooked. In Point Break, he wasn't simply an action hero chasing waves. He was a man who could lace adrenaline with sincerity. It was the first glimpse of his paradox, danger and depth bound together, as if every punch carried both muscle and melancholy. The tide had shifted, and the world began to take notice. That tide surged with speed. The bus exploded, the world cheered, Sandra Bullock by his side, and overnight, Keanu was vaulted into the stratosphere. Yet, when the studio waved a fortune for a sequel, he chose the harder road. He refused to trade integrity for repetition. That single no was a line drawn in blood, proof that his career would not be built on shortcuts, but on principle. Hollywood, in its unforgiving way, made him pay. Labels like reckless and unwise clung to him, sharp as glass, but Keanu bore them in silence. As if to test him further, the mid-90s became another crucible. Johnny Mnemonic and Chain Reaction faltered. Critics circled like vultures and whispers spread. Maybe he was just a pretty face, hollow beneath the eyes. But then My Own Private Idaho changed everything. Beside River Phoenix, his closest friend and spiritual brother Keanu, bared a raw intimacy that no critic could deny. River was the family he had never known, wild, tender, broken in ways that mirrored his own. Their friendship was sanctuary, a fragile refuge in an industry built on masks. For a time it seemed Keanu had found a light strong enough to quiet the shadows that had haunted him since childhood. Yet beyond that fragile light, fate was already sharpening its blade. And then, in 1999, the storm broke. The Matrix demanded everything. To become Neo, Keanu turned his body into a battlefield. Weeks of martial arts left his muscles screaming. Wirework twisted his frame until every joint begged for mercy, and a neck injury forced him to strap into braces while still learning to fight. He bent reality on screen, but off-screen, he bent himself into agony. For audiences, Neo was a revelation. For Keanu, it was destiny written in blood and pain, success carved directly into his bones. But applause is fickle. When the credits faded, the old doubts crept back. Wooden, limited, lucky. The same words that once haunted him in classrooms now echoed through headlines. Misunderstood, mislabeled, mocked, and Keanu climbed anyway. Each insult another stone on the mountain he refused to stop climbing. Then came resurrection. In 2014, when many of his peers were fading into cameos, John Wick struck like lightning. What began as a revenge thriller became myth. Keanu trained with brutal devotion, days on shooting ranges, nights behind the wheel, weeks of choreography so punishing that bruises turned his body into a living map of sacrifice. His aging knees screamed, yet he refused to hand the work to doubles. On screen, John Wick was a man surviving grief. Off-screen, Keanu was a man surviving the toll of giving everything. By Chapter 4, the franchise had crowned him not just as a star reborn, but as a warrior carved from endurance itself. For Keanu Reeves, glory has never been gentle. Every triumph left a scar. Every standing ovation hid hours of suffering. The world saw Neo dodging bullets and John Wick dismantling armies. But behind the curtain was a man whose body bore the cost of every cheer, whose heart carried losses no role could erase. And just as he stood highest, the shadows of private tragedy were waiting, ready to remind him that even the brightest fame could never outshine grief. Keanu Reeves has always been described as a man of mystery, and nowhere is that more true than in the story of his heart. His romantic life was never the glittering carousel of red carpets that Hollywood adores. Instead, it was a path littered with tender beginnings, whispered longings, and heartbreaks that would one day carve scars deeper than applause could ever heal. His first true romance came in the late 1980s when he met actress Jill Sholin on the set of Babes in Toyland. For 3 fleeting years, they clung to each other like young dreamers, scribbling futures in the sky, daring to believe that love could grant them permanence. But Jill's extroverted sparkle collided with Keanu's quiet reserve, and the distance between their rising careers pulled them apart. In 1989, their love unraveled. For Keanu, it was not just the end of a relationship, it was the shattering of his first fragile belief that love could become home. That early heartbreak left an ache that lingered like a bruise on the soul, teaching him a truth that would haunt his years. Love, no matter how radiant, could vanish as easily as smoke in the wind. After Jill, his name drifted through tabloids like a shadow with no anchor. Whispers of Sofia Coppola, fleeting dinners with Diane Keaton, rumors tying him to Claire Forlani, Charlize Theron, Cameron Diaz. Some may have been real, others inventions of a restless press. Yet Keanu himself never indulged the circus. He moved through fame with a deliberate restraint, carrying his heart like fragile glass, as though he already knew the spotlight could fracture what it touched. Behind every rumor was a silence that spoke louder, a man unwilling to gamble tenderness against spectacle. Among the noise, two connections stood apart, too genuine to be dismissed as gossip. Sandra Bullock, his radiant partner in Speed, confessed years later that she had once harbored a crush. Keanu admitted the feeling was mutual, yet both chose to protect what mattered more. They buried the possibility of romance, locking it away before it could be tested, and in doing so, created something rarer, a friendship that has endured more than 3 decades. In Sandra, Keanu found laughter that healed, loyalty that asked for nothing, and the bittersweet knowledge that sometimes the purest love is the one that never dares change its name. For audiences, they remain the couple that might have been. For Keanu, Sandra is the proof that not all love stories need the word romance to last a lifetime. Winona Ryder, meanwhile, became something closer to a soul twin. Their bond began in 1992 on the set of Bram Stoker's Dracula, where they enacted a wedding so authentic that Winona still jokes they might, in some inexplicable way, truly be married. What lingered after the folklore was something unspoken, yet undeniable. Two guarded souls who recognized themselves in each other's silence. Together they shared not headlines, but trust, not passion, but sanctuary. Their connection was a love without a name, tender enough to survive decades, haunting enough to leave the world forever wondering what it might have been. But love would return in a form that felt undeniable. In 1998, at a party for his band Dogstar, Keanu met actress Jennifer Syme. Luminous, tender, with a spirit that mirrored his own quiet awe. Their connection was immediate, profound, as though fate had finally decided to grant him what he had long been denied. Not just affection, but the fragile hope of family. For a man who had grown up packing and unpacking suitcases, who had carried emptiness where a father should have stood, Jennifer was more than romance. She was a promise. Soon they moved in together, creating a modest sanctuary far from cameras, where ordinary moments, cooking, music, late-night laughter, felt like treasures he had been chasing all his life. By 1999, Jennifer was pregnant with their first child. For Keanu, it was not simply joy, it was redemption. The dream he had carried since boyhood, of a stable home, of holding a daughter in his arms, of finally mending the fractures of his past, was within reach. He prepared for her arrival with a tenderness that surprised even his closest friends. In Jennifer's eyes, he saw a future that might finally quiet the grief that had followed him since childhood. Then came the cruelty that words can barely hold. On Christmas Eve of 1999, their daughter Ava was stillborn. The nursery they had prepared stood silent, filled not with a baby's cries, but with unbearable quiet. A room transformed into a shrine of absence. The little clothes folded neatly in drawers, the empty crib waiting in vain, became daily reminders of a joy denied. Friends recall Keanu's haunted stillness, the way his eyes seemed to carry a weight beyond language. He did not lash out. He did not speak often, but his silence was deafening. The silence of a man whose hope had been torn from him before he could even hold it. The loss struck at the very heart of their love. For a fleeting moment, Keanu had believed he was on the cusp of healing the old wounds that had marked his life. With Jennifer, he had glimpsed the family he had always yearned for. But fate, merciless as ever, was not finished with him. What began as a love marked by light had already been claimed by darkness. And just beyond the horizon, an even crueler shadow waited, one that would carve into Keanu Reeves the deepest wound of all. The shadow that had stalked Keanu Reeves since childhood rose again in the cruelest way imaginable. In April 2001, the phone call came, the kind of call that splits a life into before and after. Jennifer Syme, the woman who had been his steady flame, his one glimpse of family and future, was gone. The accident had taken her instantly. Those who stood near him later recalled not a scream, not a collapse, but something far more haunting: stillness. He froze as though the very air had been torn from his lungs. It was not noise that marked his grief, but silence. A silence so suffocating it seemed to press against the walls and crush the room. For a man who had lived with absence all his life, the universe had now delivered its most merciless confirmation that anyone he dared to love could vanish without warning, leaving only shadows where light had been. The days that followed were not days at all, but a waking nightmare. Reporters gathered, cameras waited, but what they captured was not Neo, not John Wick, not the star of the Matrix, whose image had been projected on screens across the globe. They captured only a man hollowed out by loss, stripped of all the armor that fame had given him. At the funeral, Keanu walked forward with Jennifer's coffin on his shoulder, his head lowered, his eyes cast down, his expression unreadable, yet devastating in its restraint. Each step seemed to carry not just the weight of the casket, but the unbearable truth that half of his heart was being lowered into the ground. The flashbulbs caught his silhouette, but not the silence. They could not capture the way he lingered at her grave after the others had drifted away. Hands clenched, shoulders slightly hunched, a figure carved out of sorrow, as if by standing there long enough he could will her back, or hold the world still so she would not slip further away. Those who knew him said his grief was bottomless, but it rarely broke the surface. It lived instead in his eyes, eyes that carried a vacancy no performance could conceal. It lived in the heaviness of his walk, in the pauses that punctuated his voice, in the quiet distance that began to define his presence. He returned to film sets, to scripts, to the machinery of Hollywood, but nothing in him was unchanged. On screen, he bent bullets, rose from impossible battles, and survived against all odds. Off screen, he lived with the truth that no role could rewrite. In the one battle that mattered most, he had been powerless. Grief changes shape, but it never ends, he would later say. And in those words lived more than philosophy. It was confession, testimony, a roadmap of his life. For Keanu, grief was not a storm that passed. It was a companion that never left, reshaping itself into silence, into distance, into the haunted calm that audiences mistook for mystery. Jennifer's death was not just another tragedy in his story. It was the cruelest chapter in a book already stained with loss, the moment that carved into him a final, devastating lesson. That love, no matter how radiant, can be stolen in an instant. And yet, even as that truth hollowed him, it also defined him. It became the wellspring of the quiet dignity, the unexpected tenderness, the humanity that would one day make the world love him not only as a star, but as a man. Jennifer's absence became part of his presence. Her memory folded into the gentleness he extended to strangers, to colleagues, to anyone who crossed his path. In carrying her loss, Keanu Reeves became more than an actor. He became a vessel of compassion, a legend of humanity itself. Life had never been gentle with him, and it would not soften now. This time, fate's cruelty came not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, merciless erosion of someone bound to him by blood. His younger sister, Kim Reeves, only 2 years his junior, was diagnosed with leukemia. From that moment, Keanu's life became a pendulum swinging between the blinding lights of Hollywood and the sterile corridors of hospitals. On screen, the world saw him as Neo, the indestructible savior, bending bullets and defying destiny. Off-screen, he was a brother in a thin hospital chair, shoulders slumped, reading aloud through the endless nights while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. His hand clasped Kim's as chemotherapy drained her body, his voice steady even when his heart broke with every pause in her breathing. The contrast was unbearable. On one side, fans screamed his name on red carpets. On the other, he whispered hers in quiet prayers, begging for a miracle medicine could not always promise. Friends remember the small acts that revealed the depth of his devotion. How he quietly bought a home near Los Angeles so Kim would never feel far from him. How he rearranged entire shooting schedules to fly back to Toronto at a moment's notice. How he turned down roles without explanation, because some days nothing in the world mattered more than simply sitting at her bedside. In those hospital rooms, under the antiseptic glow, Keanu Reeves was not a star. He was simply a brother, fragile, exhausted, human, and yet utterly unwilling to leave her side. Kim fought with unimaginable courage, and after long years of treatment, she eventually reached remission. To the world, it looked like a victory. But for Keanu, the scars of her battle never healed. He had already known the agony of sudden loss, a car crash, a stillborn child, lives stolen in an instant. But this was grief in its slowest, cruelest form, watching someone you love more than yourself suffer day after day, and realizing that all the money, all the fame, all the devotion in the world could not take the pain away. That helplessness etched itself into him, leaving a mark no role, no applause could ever erase. From that crucible of sorrow grew one of his most extraordinary hidden legacies. Without speeches, without headlines, Keanu quietly founded a charitable foundation dedicated to children's hospitals and cancer research. He gave millions but never attached his name, never sought applause. It was not charity for credit. It was gratitude, whispered thanks to every doctor and nurse who had stood by his sister, and a vow to spare other families the helplessness he had endured. Kim's illness was another chapter in the book of sorrow he had been forced to read since childhood. Life had already stripped him of a father, a child, and the woman he loved. But with Kim, he proved something more enduring, that love, patient, steady, selfless, could survive even in the shadow of death. The world will never see the countless nights he walked hospital corridors, whispering reassurances, tears staining the silence. Yet those invisible nights shaped him as surely as any role he ever played. In every performance, in every quiet gesture of generosity, the echo of Kim's battle lingers. Her survival was not just her triumph, it was his redemption. Proof that even in a life stalked by relentless loss, there are battles worth fighting and bonds that no darkness can erase. Some wounds do not creep in slowly. They strike in a single night, tearing the world apart before you even know it's broken. That night came for Keanu Reeves in October 1993, when the news reached him that River Phoenix, his closest friend and chosen brother, had collapsed outside the Viper Room in Los Angeles and never rose again. River was only 23, a prodigy consumed too soon by a fatal mix that stole the breath from his body and the future from his hands. For Hollywood, it was the loss of a rising star. For Keanu, it was the theft of his other half. They had been more than colleagues. On the set of My Own Private Idaho, they had bared themselves without masks, two young men from broken homes, each carrying loneliness like a hidden wound, finding in the other a reflection that made the chaos survivable. River was fire, dazzling, restless, untamed. Keanu was stone, steady, grounding, quietly protective. Together they created a balance that felt unbreakable. But the unbreakable shattered overnight. Those who were close to him recall that Keanu did not erupt when the news came. Instead, he folded into silence. Later, he confessed he spent hours crying alone, unable to be consoled, his grief pouring out in waves no one else could see. In front of cameras, he spoke little. It was not denial. It was the only armor he had left. The pain was too sacred to display, so he buried it and carried it forward like a ghost that followed him from set to set. The loss carved into every role he took afterward. When critics praised the depth of sorrow in his performances, they were witnessing more than acting. They were seeing River's absence channeled through him, the shadow behind his eyes, the quiet pauses, the way his characters seemed to know that joy is always fragile. Every triumph of his career in the years that followed was haunted by the silence of a friend who should have been there to share it. And yet, River's death was not only a personal tragedy, it became a cautionary tale. In it was the reminder that talent, youth, and brilliance are not shields against life's cruelties, that even the brightest flames can be extinguished if we mistake recklessness for freedom. Keanu never turned that lesson into sermons, but he embodied it, living with humility, shunning excess, showing gratitude for the simple gift of being alive. Grief changes shape, but it never ends, he would later say. In the silence left by River, those words became prophecy. River's passing was not just the end of a friendship. It was the permanent theft of a brotherhood that had once lit his world. And though the scar never closed, it shaped Keanu into the man the world now reveres. Proof that the deepest wounds, borne quietly and with dignity, can transform pain into compassion and loss into a legacy that outlives the fallen. The body, like the heart, has limits, and for Keanu Reeves, every film has carved those limits deeper until pain itself became his most unrelenting companion. The applause faded, the lights dimmed, but the toll remained, etched into him like scars on stone. The world worshipped the myth of the indestructible warrior. What it never saw was the man limping into the shadows after the cameras cut, carrying pain stitched into his very frame, silence masking the torment of a body pushed beyond forgiveness. It began with The Matrix, when Hollywood demanded not just performance, but transformation. For months he surrendered himself to martial arts drills so merciless that he staggered out trembling, drenched in sweat, muscles shaking from exhaustion. The wirework twisted his frame. The choreography bruised his skin until finally came the cruelest blow, a spinal injury so grave that doctors warned paralysis was a possibility. Surgeons performed delicate neck surgery, fusing vertebrae and stabilizing his spine with precision. Most would have surrendered. Keanu did not. Before the scars had even healed, still strapped in a brace, he returned to training. On screen, Neo bent bullets and defied physics. Off-screen, Keanu bent himself into relentless pain, each move a defiance against the limits threatening to consume him. "I never wanted to let the audience down," he would confess, words that carried the quiet weight of a vow sealed in suffering. But cinema is merciless. and the cost only climbed. When John Wick arrived, he refused to hide behind doubles. He drilled live fire training until his fingertips blistered. He threw his body into judo slams and jujitsu locks until his shoulders ached with fire. He rehearsed gun-fu sequences with such obsession that his knuckles stiffened and swelled. Nights were spent on racetracks, spinning cars at blistering speeds, the violence of the drift rattling his body to the core. By Chapter 4, the price had been carved visibly into his stride, knees worn down by years of punishing impacts, tendons stiff as steel pulled too tight, every landing sending shocks through joints long past their prime. Fans marveled at his precision. Doctors would have marveled simply that he could still walk at all. And through it all, Keanu never allowed complaint to leave his lips. No headlines of protest, no indulgence in self-pity, only discipline, only the silent agreement that his body would falter before his promise to the audience ever did. The man who seemed untouchable on screen was in truth a man who had chosen to pay for every frame with his own strength. His legend was not built on invincibility, it was built on endurance, on a willingness to suffer quietly so that others might believe in heroes. Then, in his 6th decade, came the cruel reminder that no body can defy time. It happened on the set of Good Fortune, during what should have been a simple cold immersion scene. One slip, one wrong angle, and his knee gave way with a sound he later described as like a potato chip breaking. It was more than a crack in the joint. It was the sound of time itself, breaking into his silence, reminding him that even legends cannot outrun age. For days, he walked in immobilization, forcing himself through therapy, willing his body forward so the cameras could keep rolling. The injury was not life-threatening, but it was symbolic, the clearest sign yet that even the strongest walls eventually revealed their fractures. "My heart wants to keep going," he admitted quietly, "but I'm not sure my knees agree." What breaks the heart is not the injury itself, but the way Keanu meets it. He does not curse his body or rage against age. Instead, he listens. He adapts. He trades the punishing iron discipline of the gym for gentler rituals. Long swims, quiet walks at dusk, stretches performed with the patience of prayer. He treats recovery as ceremony, a way of honoring the body that has carried him through storms. It is humility in its purest form, to bow to limits without surrendering spirit, to accept fragility and still rise each morning with discipline intact. Fans who have seen him step onto a stage in recent years notice the subtle limp, the careful way he lowers himself into a chair, the fleeting wince he hides behind a smile. These are not signs of weakness, but living proof that every triumph has been bought with sacrifice. To audiences, his characters remain bulletproof. Neo dodging bullets, John Wick dismantling armies. But if you look closer, the truth whispers through every slowed step, every pause between movements, every breath that seems to carry weight. Keanu Reeves has paid for every frame with flesh. Each ovation has cost him nights in ice baths, mornings where pain lingered in every joint, whispered prayers that his body would hold long enough for one more scene. Glory for him has never been free. It has been bought moment by moment with scars carved into muscle and bone. And still he carries it. Just as he has carried grief, he carries pain quietly, without complaint. Never as spectacle, but always as choice. As his silence is not emptiness, but resilience. The calm of a man who refuses to let suffering define him. The man who once bent reality as Neo, who avenged love as John Wick, now bends himself toward survival. At 61, His health bears the undeniable marks of time and sacrifice, knees worn, tendons stiff, strength tested. And yet those very marks are what make him extraordinary. They are not the end of his legend, but the proof of it. For fans, this truth is both devastating and uplifting. To watch him now is to see not just an actor, but a warrior of endurance. A man who has turned frailty into strength, scars into symbols, and every painful step into proof of what it means to give everything for art. Each limp, each scar, each weary breath is not a weakness. It is a monument to devotion, to resilience, to the unyielding spirit of Keanu Reeves. Now, having just crossed his 61st birthday, Keanu Reeves no longer seeks the roar of stadiums or the glitter of premieres to measure his worth. The man who once bent reality as Neo and fought through armies as John Wick has carved out a different kind of stage, one without cameras, applause, or scripts. His sanctuary lies high above the restless sprawl of Los Angeles, in a house perched quietly in the folds of the Hollywood Hills. It is not the kind of house that shouts for attention. Purchased in the early 2000s after decades of drifting through hotels and rented apartments, the property measures more than 5,600 square feet on less than half an acre of land. Yet to call it a mansion would miss the point entirely. Its walls of glass open wide to the horizon, letting morning light spill across shaded patios and into rooms designed not for spectacle, but for peace. A koi pond glimmers in the courtyard. A lap pool stretches narrow and long, its edge seeming to dissolve into the skyline, inviting not performance, but therapy. There are verandas where twilight lingers, like an old friend, and gardens where silence gathers as if it has been waiting for him all his life. The architecture, originally built in the late 1980s for an art collector, mirrors Keanu's own values. It is modernist, yet warm, minimalist, yet alive with natural light. One wing dissolves the boundary between indoors and out, just as Keanu himself has sought openness without spectacle. At the entryway, black panels do not declare grandeur. They whisper restraint. Friends who have visited say the home feels less like a celebrity estate and more like a temple of calm. A place where grief can soften, where the body can breathe, where the soul can recover. But the sanctuary has not always been untouched. In 2014, 2 intrusions shattered its stillness, forcing Keanu to strengthen security with quiet layers of technology. Even so, the house was never designed to wall the world out. It was designed to hold his heart steady within. For a man whose net worth is estimated at several hundred million, the house is not a monument to wealth. It is a vessel of healing, proof that money in his hands is not for grandeur, but for shelter. Here he shares life with Alexandra Grant, the visual artist who has been his partner in recent years. Their story began not with paparazzi flashbulbs, but with collaboration, a book project of poetry and images that grew into friendship and later into love. In 2019, their appearance together at a public gala surprised the world, less because Keanu was in love than because he had chosen at last to let that love be seen. At home, their days unfold in rhythms of quiet companionship, cooking together, hosting a few close friends, walking through art galleries, or reading side by side. She paints, he reads. Sometimes they sit in silence, letting the koi ripple through the pond as evening folds itself around the house. There are no parades, no grand declarations, only a steady pulse of intimacy, the kind that allows both of them to keep their souls intact in a world that devours privacy. This house, more than any set, is where the man behind the myth resides. After decades of loss, sacrifice, and the merciless demands of Hollywood, it is here that he has found the closest thing to rest. The glass walls catch the morning sun not as trophies, but as reminders. Even after the darkest nights, light returns. The koi pond is not ornament, but symbol, renewal gliding just beneath the surface. The lap pool is not for display, but for discipline, a ritual.